They called me rotten like sour cream. And then she did it, my own daughter. Tipped the carton over my head in the middle of the dairy aisle, under those humming fluorescent lights, while the cameras caught everything. I remember the sound first, not the words. That thin splash, like a small betrayal that had waited years for its moment. People gasped. A man's trolley clattered into a shelf. Someone laughed, not cruelly, just out of discomfort. I didn't move. I stood there with milk running down my scalp into my coat collar, dripping onto my shoes. My daughter, Claudia, stood a few feet away, breathing hard, her face twisted, not with madness, but with something worse. Certainty. She believed she was right. Rotten like sour cream, she said again, louder this time, as if she were reading from a script written by years of irritation and unspoken judgment. And then she walked away, leaving me among the yogurts and the cheese, shaking her head like I had embarrassed her. The store manager came running, but I just said, "It's fine. She's my daughter." As if that explained it, as if that made it less obscene. I'm 81. I live alone now, above a laundromat where the dryers rattle like distant thunder. My apartment smells faintly of soap and overcooked rice. I keep a single plant by the window, a spider plant that keeps multiplying no matter how many times I cut it back. I suppose that's something we have in common. But back then, in that supermarket, with milk dripping down my neck, I was still the woman who thought dignity was something you could quietly rebuild once the world turned its back on you. I didn't know yet that humiliation could be an origin story. I hadn't meant to go shopping that day. I wasn't supposed to be out alone at all. Claudia had made that clear the week before, when she told me I was getting forgetful, which was her polite way of saying inconvenient. I had been staying with her since my fall in January, sleeping in what used to be her office, now a room with a narrow cot and a window that wouldn't open. She said it was safer for me, that she'd take care of things. I wanted to believe her. I had raised her alone after her father left when she was 10. I'd worked double shifts at the hospital, packed lunches she never wanted, sewed hems late at night, always with the same mantra. She'll understand when she's older. I think that's the oldest lie mothers tell themselves. Understanding doesn't come with age. It comes with empathy, and some people never learn that language. In the months I lived with Claudia, I started disappearing by degrees. My teacup was moved to a lower shelf so you don't reach too high. My clothes were washed for me, folded into tight piles that didn't smell like me anymore. The family dog growled when I passed, and my granddaughter, Lydia, would scroll on her phone when I spoke. I told myself these were small things, that families adjust, that kindness can be noisy and clumsy when it's forced. Claudia worked long hours at a marketing firm, and her husband, Peter, was always on a call, which meant invisible behind a closed door. Dinner was often takeout eaten in separate corners of the house. I'd sit at the kitchen island, picking at lukewarm noodles, pretending not to notice how everyone else avoided sitting next to me. "It's just busy lately," Claudia said one night, when I asked if I'd done something wrong. "You overthink." She said it the way you swat at a fly, mildly irritated, certain you're right. That's how contempt begins, small, efficient, and casual. The morning of the supermarket, she'd been in a hurry. The baby had a rash, she'd spilled coffee on her blouse, and I had offered to help. "Please, Mom, just stay home," she snapped, snatching her keys from the counter. But I followed her anyway. I told myself I just wanted some fresh air to stretch my legs. In truth, I think I was hungry for witness, to exist somewhere public, where someone might see me. She parked quickly, muttering about deadlines. Inside, the store was cold, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and fruit rot. She moved fast, her heels clicking like a metronome of impatience. I trailed behind with the cart, careful not to bump anything. "Can you grab milk?" she called over her shoulder. "The 2%, not the whole. You always get the wrong one." Her tone had that practiced edge of superiority, the kind that comes from years of unspoken resentment. I picked up a carton, checked the date, fresh, 4 days out, and held it up. "This one?" She didn't answer. She was already at the self-checkout, scanning her phone. When I reached her, I made a small joke about how everything was self-service now, even motherhood. She didn't laugh. She turned, eyes sharp as glass, and said, "You know what's funny? You think everyone's still supposed to serve you." It wasn't shouted. It was worse than that. It was spoken with quiet precision, like a verdict. I think if she'd screamed, it might have hurt less. Then came the milk. It wasn't premeditated. I could see that in her trembling hands. But it was real. Cold. Heavy. Absolute. When it hit, my first instinct wasn't to cry or yell. It was to look for a napkin, to clean up, to make it easier for everyone else. That's the curse of women like me. We mistake endurance for grace. I remember looking at her and seeing not my daughter, but a stranger who wanted to erase the proof of where she came from. And I remember thinking, she's already halfway there. The store staff helped me to the restroom, gave me paper towels, offered to call someone. "Do you have family, ma'am?" one of them asked. I almost laughed. "Yes," I said. "Too much of it." I caught my reflection in the mirror. Hair plastered, blouse stained, eyes steady. There was no self-pity there, only a slow, gathering clarity. Outside, I could hear the hum of the refrigeration units, the distant voice of my daughter arguing with the manager about privacy and context. I walked out quietly, left the cart where it was, and stepped into the parking lot. The air smelled like spring mud and exhaust. My coat was still damp, sticking to my neck. I didn't wait for her. I walked to the bus stop across the street, sat on the bench, and let the sun dry my hair. The milk crusted on my skin, sour and sticky. I thought about how many years I'd spent apologizing for existing, for being tired, for being poor, for growing old. It occurred to me that maybe the rot Claudia saw wasn't decay at all. Maybe it was fermentation, something changing form, becoming sharper, stronger, harder to swallow. On the bus ride home, I noticed a boy staring at me. A teenager with earbuds and acne, trying not to look curious. I wanted to tell him that humiliation has a texture, that it clings like milk on wool, that it can make you clean in a way pride never could. But I said nothing. I sat there, dripping quietly, until the bus reached my stop. When I climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment, I peeled off my coat, hung it over the radiator, and watched the wet patch spread slowly, like a wound drying. I made tea, sat by the window, and listened to the hum of the dryers below. Somewhere in that sound was a strange kind of comfort, the rhythm of cycles, of things turning over, of stains being rinsed out. I thought of Claudia, probably scrubbing her hands raw, trying to erase the smell of me. I didn't hate her. I just finally stopped excusing her. That night, I wrote in the small notebook I keep by my bed, the one with the blue cover I bought at the pharmacy. I wrote only one sentence. They poured milk on my head, but it washed something clean. Then I closed it, turned off the lamp, and lay back. The sound of the laundromat below was steady, mechanical, eternal. For the first time in years, I wasn't rehearsing apologies in my head. I wasn't thinking about what I should have said or done differently. I was thinking about the word rotten, how it isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's the beginning of something stronger. And though I didn't know it yet, that moment in the dairy aisle would follow me into a courtroom, into a new kind of life, into the quiet courage of saying aloud, "No more." The defining moment of betrayal didn't happen when the milk hit my head. That was only the public eruption of something that had been fermenting for years. The real catalyst came afterward, in the silence that followed. There is a particular sound that comes after humiliation, a kind of thin ringing in the ears, like the air itself is embarrassed for you. That was what I heard as I sat in the manager's office, wrapped in a towel they'd fetched from the back room. The walls smelled like floor cleaner, and the fluorescent light buzzed faintly, giving everything a sickly hue. They'd offered to call my daughter, but she was the reason I was there, sitting drenched in dairy, so I just said I'd handle it myself. When I looked up, I saw the security monitor replaying what had happened, looping quietly, mercilessly. The image was grainy, colorless, but unmistakable. My daughter's arm lifting, the milk spilling, the bystanders turning away. The young assistant manager, a boy no older than my granddaughter, muttered that he was sorry and asked if I wanted to press charges. I said no. Not yet. Because in that moment I wasn't angry. I was stunned by the plainness of it all. Betrayal rarely looks cinematic. It happens in aisles under bright lights while strangers check their phones. I left the store and walked to the bus stop again, carrying nothing but my wet purse and the faint smell of spoiled milk. My phone buzzed. One message from Claudia. "You made a scene. We'll talk later." No apology, no remorse, only the transactional tone she reserved for scheduling cleaners or ordering groceries. I deleted it without reading the rest. By the time I reached home, the sky had gone that bruised shade of evening that makes everything look colder than it is. I peeled off my clothes, threw them in the sink, and turned on the tap. The water ran white for a few seconds, then clear. I remember thinking how strange it was that milk, something meant to nourish, could look so much like poison once it left its carton. The next day I stayed in bed. My joints ached from the cold, but it wasn't the body that hurt. It was the memory. I replayed her words, rotten like sour cream, and tried to trace their origin. Claudia had always had a cruel streak disguised as cleverness, a sharpness she wielded like proof of sophistication. As a child, she would correct my grammar, laugh at my accent, roll her eyes when I used old-fashioned phrases. I used to find it endearing, evidence that she was becoming worldly, educated, unafraid. Only now did I realize it had been a kind of pruning, slowly cutting away the parts of me that embarrassed her. When she left for college, she barely called. When her father died, she said, "You'll be fine, Mom. You're strong." Like grief was a household chore I could schedule for later. Over time, I stopped expecting tenderness from her, and she stopped pretending to offer it. I told myself that's what adulthood was. Distance. That was the excuse I carried into every interaction, even when the distance became exile. When I moved into her house after my fall, she made a show of generosity, telling friends, "Of course I'm taking Mom in. What kind of daughter wouldn't?" But the kindness ended at the threshold. Inside those walls, I became furniture. If I cooked, I made a mess. If I cleaned, I rearranged things wrong. If I spoke, I interrupted. She called it help. I called it containment. I remember once, late at night, hearing her whisper to Peter, "She just lingers." That word, lingers, burned more than anything else. It made me sound like a smell, something left behind too long. After the supermarket incident, she didn't come by for 2 days. No calls, no texts. On the third morning, I opened the door to find a brown envelope slipped under the mat. Inside was a note. "Mom, I think it's best if you stay at your place for a while until things cool off. We're all stressed. Don't make this harder." No signature, just her clean handwriting, detached and efficient. There was also a folded check. Reimbursement, perhaps, for the groceries, or guilt translated into numbers. I tore it in half. That was the moment I felt something shift. Not rage, that would have been easy, but a colder, quieter resolve. I realized she wanted me invisible, not dead, not gone, just erased from her narrative. That's when I decided to make myself undeniable. The first step was small. I called the supermarket. The same young manager answered. When I told him my name, there was a pause. "Ma'am," he said, "we still have the incident report. And the footage, if you need it." His voice softened, tentative. "I think you should see it." 2 days later, I went back. The store felt different, smaller, more haunted. He led me to the office again, turned the monitor toward me, and pressed play. The scene unfolded in silence. Claudia's face was calm at first, her gestures rehearsed, pointing at the milk, correcting me. Then a flicker, something raw and sudden, and the splash. The camera caught everything, her words, her posture, the indifference afterward. Watching it was like staring into a mirror I hadn't realized existed. I didn't cry. I only said, "Please, make me a copy." That night, I watched the video again on my old laptop, frame by frame. Each second carried years of subtext. The small humiliations, the lowered eyes, the way she checked to see who was watching before she struck. It was evidence, yes, but more than that, it was proof that I hadn't imagined the cruelty. Abusers often make you doubt your memory. They gaslight you into silence, convince you that your pain is exaggeration. But the camera didn't lie. It had no agenda, no history. It simply witnessed. And that, oddly enough, gave me peace. The following morning, I called a number I found on a pamphlet at the library. Elder Legal Assistance for Abuse Victims. The woman who answered had a warm voice, steady and patient. Her name was Amelia. She didn't sound surprised when I explained. "It happens more often than you think," she said gently. "Would you be willing to come in?" I hesitated. Reporting your own child feels like treason. It feels like confessing to failure. But then I remembered the sound of Claudia's voice in that video, the satisfaction in her tone, and I said yes. At the legal aid office, everything smelled like burnt coffee and paperwork. Amelia was younger than I expected, maybe in her 30s, with tired eyes that had clearly seen too many versions of my story. She asked for details, dates, witnesses. I handed her the USB drive. When she watched it, she didn't flinch or gasp. She only nodded slowly and said, "We can work with this." Her calmness steadied me. She explained that elder mistreatment, especially when public and recorded, could be prosecuted or at least used to file a civil complaint. "It's about accountability," she said, "not revenge." The word accountability sat strangely in my mouth. I'd spent decades excusing others, smoothing their edges, translating their cruelty into misunderstanding. To seek accountability felt almost indecent, like speaking too loudly in church. Leaving the office, I walked through downtown like a ghost returning to the land of the living. I bought myself a cup of coffee, real, dark, bitter, and drank it slowly on a park bench. The pigeons strutted near my feet, greedy and fearless. I thought of Claudia's face, the one the camera caught. Not the mask she wore for her friends, but the bare one, sharp and frightened by her own reflection. Somewhere in her, there was still that child who used to curl up next to me during storms, who once cried because a classmate said her shoes looked cheap. I wanted to find sympathy for that girl, but I couldn't. Not yet. When I got home, I opened the window wide for the first time in months. The air that came in smelled faintly of detergent from the laundromat below and of wet asphalt. I sat at the table and wrote a list on the back of an envelope. Copy the footage again, gather bank statements, call Amelia Tuesday. My handwriting shook, but it was legible. That list was my first act of rebellion. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about truth. And truth, when spoken by the dismissed, becomes a weapon sharper than rage. Over the next week, I received several texts from Claudia. They began with concern. Are you okay? You've been quiet. Then drifted to irritation. This is ridiculous. You're overreacting. And finally, accusation. You're making me look bad. Each message was a breadcrumb of control, an attempt to drag me back into her narrative. I didn't reply. Silence, I discovered, is a language abusers don't understand. It terrifies them. When Amelia called to confirm the appointment, she said, "We can file the initial complaint anonymously if you prefer, but the footage speaks louder than any affidavit." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. The phrase lingered. The footage speaks louder. For once, I had something that could speak for me, something irrefutable. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of that bright aisle, the milk glistening under supermarket lights like a spotlight, the crowd frozen in discomfort, and my daughter's voice echoing. Not a whisper this time, but a broadcast. She wanted the world to see me as spoiled. Soon, the world would see her instead. And that realization, quiet, heavy, inevitable, was the true beginning of everything that followed. The days that followed moved with a strange, muffled rhythm, as if sound itself had learned to step lightly around me. The incident had made its way through the neighborhood faster than I imagined. At first, I thought people were being kinder out of pity. Neighbors nodding a bit too long, the pharmacist asking how I was feeling as if grief were a prescription refill. But then I understood they weren't kind. They were careful. That's what scandal does. It doesn't erase you, it makes you radioactive. Everyone wants to appear sympathetic without catching the contagion of your story. Claudia hadn't called since her last message, the one that said, "Please, let's not make this uglier than it already is." I read it once, deleted it, and then turned off my phone. Silence became my companion, not because it was peaceful, but because it was mine. I spent hours sitting by the window, watching the world move on. It was spring, and even the trees seemed indecently cheerful. I tried to maintain routine. Mornings, I'd walk to the library, sit in the back corner where the sunlight fell on the dust like gold, and read newspapers. The article appeared 3 days later. Small headline, local section, no names. Altercation between family members recorded in supermarket. It mentioned that footage had been submitted to local authorities and that an investigation might follow. That word, might, held me in suspension. The store had filed the report on my behalf, and Amelia had officially opened a case under my name. But legal processes are slow by nature, and time, when you're waiting for justice, becomes a kind of low-grade fever. Every letter from the county office felt like a pulse. I began to notice how the world treats an elderly woman alone. Strangers spoke louder but listened less. Shop clerks called me sweetheart, with that condescending tilt of the head that means, we've already decided you're harmless. Even the postman, who had delivered my mail for years, started to ask if I needed help crossing the street. I wanted to say, I'm not fragile. I'm just untethered. The difference matters. Meanwhile, Claudia was curating her own version of events. I found out through an old friend, Lorna, who still went to the same church as my daughter. Lorna called one afternoon, hesitant, her voice tiptoeing through the receiver. I don't want to meddle, she began, which of course meant she would. But people are talking, dear. Claudia said you've been unwell, that you had an episode. My laugh startled her. An episode? I repeated. Yes, she said you've been forgetting things, that the pressure after your fall has been difficult. She's worried about you. I thanked Lorna for her concern, hung up, and sat in the dark for a long time. It wasn't enough for Claudia to humiliate me. She had to rewrite the narrative. In her story, she wasn't a cruel daughter. She was a caregiver under strain, a modern martyr of filial duty. That version would play better at parties, I suppose. The following week, a letter arrived from Claudia's lawyer. It was printed on thick paper that smelled faintly of perfume, the kind meant to suggest professionalism and distance. The words were clinical. My client wishes to express deep concern for your well-being. She feels the recent incident was a misunderstanding exacerbated by stress. We kindly request that you refrain from further dissemination of the supermarket footage, as its release could have reputational consequences for all parties involved. Reputational consequences. I read that phrase aloud several times until it stopped sounding human. I didn't reply. Instead, I called Amelia, who told me calmly, "That's intimidation disguised as diplomacy. Don't respond. Everything goes through us now." Her composure was a kind of balm. It's strange how quickly the professional kindness of a stranger can replace the counterfeit affection of family. The first escalation wasn't loud. It was slow, deliberate, bureaucratic. Claudia began erasing me in small, legal ways. I noticed my name disappearing from shared accounts, minor insurance policies being shifted. She had once convinced me to sign a power of attorney form for convenience after my hip surgery. I found the copy in my drawer, folded neatly, her signature above mine. Amelia frowned when I showed her. She could use this, she said, to argue diminished capacity. I felt a chill spread through my chest. It wasn't enough for her to discredit me morally. She wanted to erase me administratively. I spent the next week visiting offices, canceling permissions, requesting statements. Each interaction left me both stronger and more exhausted. The clerks always said the same thing. "Of course, ma'am, just a few forms," never realizing those forms were lifelines. At night, the loneliness settled heavier. I'd catch myself talking aloud, narrating what I was doing as if to an invisible audience. Now we boil the water. Now we fold the towels. Perhaps that's how the mind keeps itself company when the world refuses to listen. Sometimes I'd imagine Claudia as a child again, running through sprinklers, shrieking with laughter, milk mustache bright against her lip. That image used to make me tender. Now it made me tired. I realized love doesn't vanish when betrayed. It calcifies, turns to something dense and immovable, like coral formed around a wound. The town began to divide itself quietly. Some believed her version, others avoided choosing sides. The cashier at the corner store, a woman with kind eyes, started slipping me small kindnesses, a discount here, an extra paper bag. "I saw it online," she whispered once. "Someone posted the video before it was taken down. You didn't deserve that." Her pity embarrassed me, but her words steadied something inside. I wasn't crazy. The world had seen, even if briefly it had witnessed. Claudia's retaliation came next in subtler forms. One morning I found out my health insurance had been updated to list her as the primary contact again. The bank refused a transfer because her name was still linked to my account. Bureaucracy, once invisible, had become her weapon. She understood that modern cruelty wears a suit and carries paperwork. I told Amelia, who promised to handle it, but the anxiety lingered. Every letter in the mailbox became suspect, every unknown number a potential ambush. Around that time, Peter, my son-in-law, called. His voice was cautious, diplomatic. "Martha," he began, she's struggling. The publicity has been hard on the kids. Maybe we can resolve this quietly?" His phrasing was precise, corporate. I pictured him rehearsing in front of a mirror, trying to sound compassionate while protecting his mortgage. I asked him one question. "Did you watch the video?" There was a pause long enough to expose the lie before he said, "It's complicated." I hung up. I didn't need to hear more. When people say something is complicated, what they really mean is it's ugly, and I don't want to take sides. Days slipped into weeks. I learned to navigate solitude like a new language, slowly, awkwardly, with long pauses. I cooked for one, ate slowly, savored silence. But beneath that calm, tension grew. The investigation was advancing. Amelia called to say a formal statement would be required soon. "They'll want your testimony recorded," she explained. "It'll become public record." That thought frightened me more than I expected. My private humiliation would be archived, cited, dissected. Yet some quiet voice inside whispered that truth only matters when it's spoken aloud. Then came the night I caught sight of her again. I had gone to the pharmacy late, couldn't sleep, needed something mild. And as I stepped out into the parking lot, I saw Claudia's car parked across the street. She was inside, headlights off, phone glowing in her hand. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did. For a second, I considered walking over, knocking on the window, forcing her to look at me in the dim sodium light. Mother and daughter stripped of witnesses. But I didn't. I watched as she started the engine and drove off, tail lights bleeding red into the wet asphalt. That was the moment I understood she wasn't ashamed of what she'd done. She was terrified of losing control of the story. When I returned home, I sat by the window until dawn. The laundromat below hummed to life, the machines spinning like planets in slow orbit. I thought about how everything in this world seems designed to turn and turn until the stains are light enough to pass inspection. I wasn't clean yet, not in the way she wanted me to be, but I was changing texture. The milk that once marked me had become invisible, absorbed. The humiliation had hardened into something else, purpose, maybe, or defiance. It was difficult to name, but it pulsed steady beneath the fear. By the time Amelia called again to schedule my official deposition, I no longer trembled at the sound of Claudia's name. The first escalation had done its work. It had stripped away the illusion that family ties were sacred. They were just cords, and cords can be cut. The world outside remained indifferent, but inside, I was beginning to grow a spine again, one vertebra at a time. The supermarket had been the spectacle. This, the aftermath, was the education. And as I gathered my papers, checked the USB drive, and set the kettle to boil, I realized that healing wasn't soft or sentimental. It was administrative, procedural, deliberate. The kind of strength you sign, stamp, and notarize. The midpoint of everything came quietly, without ceremony, as most turning points do. It didn't arrive in a letter from the court or through some dramatic confrontation, but in a single, unremarkable afternoon, when the light slanted across my kitchen table and I realized that I was no longer waiting for an apology that would never come. For weeks, my days had been measured by paperwork, appointments, and the small ritual of boiling water for tea. Amelia had been steady through it all, a lighthouse in practical shoes, reminding me that truth moves at the pace of bureaucracy, not emotion. We had filed the complaint officially, the footage was secured as evidence, and now the process had become a series of procedural steps that required patience more than courage. But something in me was changing, almost imperceptibly at first, like a muscle remembering it was once strong. I stopped flinching when the phone rang, stopped rehearsing what I would say if Claudia suddenly appeared at my door. I had imagined that healing would feel like relief, but it felt more like sobriety, the sharp, lucid awareness of having lived too long inside a delusion. That afternoon, I decided to go outside without purpose. The air had that crispness of early summer when the city feels like it's holding its breath between seasons. I walked to the bus stop, rode 3 stops farther than usual, and got off near the community center. There was a bulletin board near the entrance covered with notices: piano lessons, lost cats, a watercolor group, and a flyer for Writing Through Recovery, a creative support circle for women over 60. I stood there for a long time reading the text. It wasn't the word writing that caught me. It was recovery. I didn't think of myself as recovering from anything. Survival, maybe. Endurance. But recovery implied a return to something, and I wasn't sure what that was. Still, I took the flyer. The class met on Wednesdays in a bright room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and coffee. There were 6 of us, all women, all carrying stories that had outlived their audiences. The facilitator, an older poet named Esther, began by saying, "We write not to make sense, but to make space." That sentence became a small anchor for me. I started showing up every week, notebook in hand, even on days when I felt hollow. We wrote prompts about memory, forgiveness, and voice. At first, I wrote stiffly, like I was filling out another form for Amelia. Precise, defensive, factual. But one evening, when Esther asked us to write about the moment we realized we were no longer seen, the words came differently. I described the supermarket not as an act of violence, but as a ritual cleansing, a baptism of humiliation. I wrote about the way milk cools as it dries, how it leaves a faint smell even after scrubbing, and how that smell becomes a reminder that something inside you has turned, not spoiled, but transformed. When I finished reading aloud, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Esther said softly, "That's not decay. That's evolution." After that night, I started writing daily. Not about Claudia, not directly, but about the small textures of my new life. The hiss of the laundromat machines below, the weight of coins in my pocket when I bought bread, the precise way sunlight fell on my windowsill at 5 in the evening. I realized I was documenting proof of existence, evidence that I was still here, still capable of noticing beauty even after cruelty. That awareness didn't erase the pain, but it diluted it, the way cream softens bitterness in coffee. The anger that had once felt volcanic began to settle into sediment, layers of meaning I could sift through instead of drowning in. Around that time, Amelia called with news. "They're moving forward," she said. "There'll be a hearing to determine whether a restraining order and financial independence clause are necessary." Her tone was professional, but I heard the quiet satisfaction underneath. She'd seen too many of these cases dissolve under pressure, families convincing victims to withdraw complaints. "You're doing well," she said. I thanked her, though I wasn't sure what well meant anymore. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, reading over my own handwriting. My words had begun to shift in tone. Where once there had been confusion, now there was description, observation, even humor. I wrote about my plant's stubborn refusal to die, about the cat that sometimes wandered in through the open window and acted as though it owned the place. I laughed out loud, not a dramatic cinematic laugh, just a small exhale of disbelief that I could still feel amusement at all. One morning, as I was walking back from the library, I saw a familiar face sitting on a bench by the square. It was Peter, my son-in-law, dressed in a suit, scrolling his phone. For a moment I thought of crossing the street, pretending I hadn't seen him, but he looked up and our eyes met. There was a brief flicker of discomfort before he smiled, polite but hollow. "Martha," he said, standing, "you look, well." That word again, the universal currency of avoidance. "Peter," I replied evenly, "I hear the family's been busy." He rubbed the back of his neck, his practiced humility slipping. "Claudia's been having a hard time," he said. "The kids have questions. It's been rough." I nodded. Yes, humiliation tends to ripple outward. Unfortunately, I didn't start the wave. He flinched but didn't argue. After a pause, he added, "She's worried about you. She says you've been talking to lawyers." I looked at him and smiled in a way that must have unnerved him because his eyes darted to the ground. "I'm talking to the truth," I said. "Sometimes it takes a lawyer to translate it." He muttered something about hoping we could resolve things peacefully. I left him standing there, half relieved, half afraid of a woman who had finally stopped apologizing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The conversation replayed in my mind, not because it had hurt me, but because I realized something. They still thought this was temporary, that I'd tire of the noise and retreat into the familiar silence of maternal guilt. That was the rhythm they were counting on. A woman who bends, not one who breaks free. I got up, turned on the lamp, and wrote in my notebook, "I am not returning. I am not waiting for the door to reopen. I am building a new one." The words looked almost foreign on the page, as if written by someone braver than me, but they steadied me nonetheless. Over the next few weeks, my routines deepened into a kind of gentle independence. I joined a morning Tai Chi group at the park, bought myself a new pair of walking shoes, started cooking recipes I'd never dared try, because Claudia once said, "You always make everything too heavy." I learned that I liked lentils, that I hated silence during dinner, that the radio could be a friend. When the community center asked for volunteers for their literacy program, I signed up to read with children on Saturdays. The first time I sat with a 7-year-old girl named June and listened to her sound out the word enough, something caught in my throat. I realized it was the first time in years I'd said that word and not meant limitation, but abundance. Amelia visited once to help me prepare my testimony. She sat at my table, papers spread neatly, reading glasses perched low. "You've come far," she said, scanning my notes. "When we first met, You could barely say her name without shaking. I smiled. Now I can say it like an address I no longer live at. She chuckled, then turned serious. There's a strength in calm, Martha. Don't underestimate it. I told her I wasn't angry anymore, and she nodded. That's how you win, she said. They can't weaponize what you've already accepted. That evening, after she left, I walked to the window and looked down at the laundromat. Through the glass, I could see the rhythm of machines turning, shirts and sheets tumbling endlessly. It struck me that healing looks a lot like laundry: repetitive, mundane, necessary, and always incomplete. You wash, you dry, you fold, and then you begin again. There's never a final load. There's just maintenance, care, and the refusal to let stains define the fabric. When the hearing date arrived in the mail, I didn't tremble. I pinned the notice to my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a daisy. The date was 2 weeks away. I brewed tea, sat in the fading light, and thought about the supermarket aisle, the splash, the smell, the laughter that had rippled around me. It no longer replayed as trauma. It played like an origin myth. That was the day I stopped being background and became a witness, not just against her, but for myself. Somewhere between that white flood of milk and the ink on the legal documents, I had crossed a threshold. The world hadn't changed. I had. I wrote another line in my notebook before bed. She poured milk on me to humiliate me. But milk is for nourishment. She just forgot who it was meant to feed. Then I turned off the light and let the night settle around me. Not as a weight, but as a soft cover, a kind of earned quiet. For the first time in a long while, I slept without dreaming of defense. The second escalation began not with confrontation, but with attention. The kind of public attention that turns private pain into community gossip. By the time summer deepened, the case had gained traction. The video had been reviewed, the official hearing scheduled, and whispers began to seep through the edges of my once quiet existence. People I barely knew from the neighborhood started greeting me with that delicate, overcompensating sympathy reserved for the newly widowed or the publicly disgraced. In the corner store, the clerk lowered her voice to ask, "Was that really your daughter?" And in the post office line, someone muttered, "I'd never survive something like that," loud enough for me to hear. I learned that shame has a half-life. It fades from those who cause it, but lingers in those who receive it. Yet for the first time, the shame wasn't mine to carry. I had stepped out of the circle of humiliation and was watching it rotate around Claudia instead. The town's fascination wasn't with the cruelty of the act itself, but with the discomfort of seeing it caught on camera. The world forgives the unseen. It cannot stomach evidence. Claudia must have felt it too, because soon her tone changed. After months of silence, she started sending messages again, long, meandering texts that blurred apology with accusation. "Mom, I wish you'd talk to me directly," one read. "These people don't know our history. You're letting strangers define us." Another followed a day later. "I was under so much stress. You've always been dramatic. I didn't mean to hurt you." They arrived late at night, as though she hoped the darkness might soften me. I didn't answer. Each message was another thread tugging at the old fabric between us, a fabric I had spent months unraveling stitch by stitch. But then she left a voicemail. Her voice cracked on the edges, the performance of a daughter trying to sound both weary and loving. "Mom, please," she said. "Think of the family. The kids are scared. They've seen the video. What are you doing to us?" I played it twice, Not out of cruelty, but out of curiosity. To hear if there was any real fear in her tone. There was, but not the kind she claimed. It wasn't fear of loss. It was fear of exposure. Amelia advised me to keep all correspondence. It's evidence of manipulation, she said, stacking her papers neatly, as always. If she contacts you again, forward it to me. Don't engage. I promised I wouldn't, but the silence afterward felt heavier than I expected. A mother's instinct, after all, is to respond, even to venom. Some reflex deep in me still wanted to believe that her reaching out meant regret. Yet each message proved the same thing. Claudia wasn't seeking forgiveness, she was seeking control. And control, once surrendered, is an addict's withdrawal. The court date loomed closer, and with it came pressure from directions I hadn't anticipated. Peter called again, this time more agitated than cautious. "You're making this worse," he said. "There's no need for lawyers. Families handle things privately." I replied evenly, "You didn't handle it privately when it happened in a supermarket." He muttered something about public humiliation, about damage to reputations. I almost laughed. "Reputation is what people build when they run out of character," I said, before hanging up. I sat for a long time afterward, staring at the phone, the pulse in my wrist steady, my heart strangely calm. It occurred to me that I was no longer arguing for my dignity. I was simply acknowledging it. That's the quiet revolution, when defense becomes declaration. A week later, the local paper published a follow-up piece. "Supermarket incident moves to court," the headline read. They didn't use our names, but the details were unmistakable. It mentioned an unnamed daughter, a video recording, and concerns regarding elder mistreatment. Beneath the text, there was a still image from the footage. 2 blurred figures, one standing rigid, one mid-motion, a frozen splash between them. It looked like abstract art, something you might hang in a gallery titled Inheritance. The article went viral locally, shared on community boards, discussed in cafes. Some readers condemned the daughter, others speculated about dementia, about generational conflict. Everyone had an opinion. No one had the truth. The day after it was published, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper torn from a notebook, handwritten in Claudia's unmistakable script. "You've humiliated me. Congratulations." No greeting, no punctuation, just that one line like a wound pressed flat against paper. I folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. It didn't sting. It simply confirmed what I already knew. She hadn't learned remorse, only resentment. Still, the escalation wasn't just emotional. It was tangible. Strange things began to happen. One afternoon, I went to the bank to withdraw cash and found the teller hesitating. "I'm sorry," she said. "There's a hold on your account. We need verification from your cosigner." I blinked. "There is no cosigner." She double-checked, frowned, and said, "There's been a recent update." I felt the ground shift slightly beneath me. Claudia had attempted to access my finances again. Amelia handled it swiftly, but the violation lingered. It's one thing to be insulted, it's another to be erased. That evening, I poured myself a small glass of wine, my first in months, and sat by the window watching the streetlights bloom. The laundromat below glowed pale yellow, the steady hum of dryers like distant applause. I thought about how daughters inherit their mother's silence long before they inherit their strength. I had taught her composure, self-reliance, the art of not needing. I had thought that was wisdom. Now I saw it had been camouflage. the very thing that made my suffering invisible. I had given her a script of endurance, and she had rewritten it as entitlement. That realization was sharper than any insult. A few days before the hearing, Amelia called. Her tone was businesslike, but gentle. "They've filed a counterclaim," she said. "Defamation of character." I laughed before I could stop myself. "You can't defame someone by quoting their own actions," I said. But the absurdity didn't comfort me. The legal machine grinds, slow but heavy, and even a false accusation leaves residue. "Don't worry," Amelia reassured. "It's procedural. It's meant to intimidate you." She was right. Still, that night, I dreamt of Claudia's voice echoing through a courtroom, not pleading innocence but performing it. The next morning, I woke with the distinct sensation that the war had entered its second phase, the phase where truth is no longer enough, where the battle becomes one of endurance. The day of the hearing dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that seems indecently cheerful for something solemn. I dressed carefully. Dark blue skirt, pressed blouse, hair neatly tied. Not for them, but for me. Dignity, I had learned, isn't how you're treated. It's how you carry what they can't take. Amelia met me at the courthouse steps, folders tucked under her arm, calm as ever. "You ready?" she asked. "More than she is," I said. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. Claudia was already there, sitting beside her attorney. She looked smaller than I remembered, paler, but her posture was immaculate. That same careful poise she'd cultivated her whole life. When she turned and saw me, something flickered across her face. Not guilt, not quite anger either, but recognition. The kind of look a person gives the ghost they hoped had stayed buried. Her lawyer spoke first, weaving a story of misunderstanding, of heightened emotions, of family conflict exaggerated by public exposure. It was a polished performance, sympathetic without surrender. I sat quietly, listening, my hands folded in my lap. When Amelia rose to respond, her voice was steady, surgical. She played the footage. The sound filled the courtroom. Claudia's voice sharp, the splash audible, the gasp of onlookers. For a few seconds, even the air held still. Claudia's lawyer objected to the emotional exploitation of evidence, but the judge allowed it. There was no drama in my daughter's face, just a faint tightening around the mouth, a recognition that the story had escaped her control. Afterward, the judge spoke briefly about the seriousness of public humiliation and the duty of care owed to dependent family members. He granted my restraining order and confirmed my financial independence. It was not vengeance. It was administrative mercy. The gavel sounded like a door closing softly. As we left, I felt a wave of something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, but sorrow, vast and clean. The kind of sorrow that doesn't ache anymore. It simply exists, like air. Claudia didn't look at me when she walked past. Her perfume lingered faintly, expensive and sterile. Outside the courthouse, a journalist approached, microphone raised, asking for comment. I said only, "We were a family once." Then I walked away. In the weeks that followed, the story circulated again. News outlets framed it as a cautionary tale. Social media reduced it to spectacle. Strangers debated my life like it was fiction. I stopped reading. The noise belonged to them. My life did not. I began focusing on what came next. Small, practical things. I bought new curtains, replaced the flickering bulb in the hallway, joined Esther's writing group again. I wrote a piece titled Custody of Silence. It began. There are two kinds of daughters. Those who inherit your wounds and those who open them wider. Esther called it brave. I thought it was simply accurate. But the escalation wasn't done. One evening, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Claudia stood there, thinner, eyes shadowed, clutching a folder. For a moment, I saw the girl she once was. Frightened, stubborn, hopeful. "Mom," she said, voice trembling, "I need to talk." I didn't invite her in. She stepped forward anyway. "You've ruined me," she whispered. "Do you understand that?" I looked at her and answered calmly. "No, Claudia. I revealed you. You ruined the version of yourself that depended on my silence." She blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a child about to cry, but remembering she's too proud. "I didn't mean to," she said. "I just wanted—" She stopped. "What did you want?" I asked. "To be free of you," she said finally. "You made me feel small." The honesty of it struck me. "And did it work?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment, then shook her head. "I feel smaller now." She left the folder on the step, papers for the appeal perhaps, and walked away without another word. I didn't pick it up right away. I stood in the doorway watching her recede, her figure shrinking under the streetlight. For a brief, aching second, I almost called after her, not to forgive, but to remind her that she was still mine in some irrevocable way. But love, I realized, can exist even after belonging ends. Later that night, I finally opened the folder. Inside were copies of financial documents, handwritten notes from her lawyer, and at the bottom, a photo. The two of us from years ago, standing in the kitchen, flour on our faces, laughing. She must have kept it somewhere, perhaps forgotten it was tucked among the paperwork. I traced the outline of her younger face with my finger, then placed the photo on my refrigerator beside the court notice. The two belonged together, the before and the after, the myth and the record. That was the true second escalation. Not the courtroom, not the headlines, but the moment when she came to my door and I realized that the power had shifted completely. For decades, I had been the one seeking permission to speak, to feel, to exist without apology. Now she was the one standing outside, asking to be understood. The symmetry of it was almost cruel. Yet beneath the exhaustion, there was an odd tenderness, the faint echo of something that once resembled love. I went to bed late that night, leaving the window open to the hum of the city. The air smelled of rain and asphalt, sharp and clean. I thought about the long chain of mothers and daughters stretching backward through time. All the words swallowed, all the silences mistaken for peace. We inherit not just blood, but behavior, not just faces, but the methods of survival. I had broken that inheritance. It didn't feel heroic. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for 40 years. And somewhere in the quiet, I began to understand that the rest of my life wouldn't be defined by what had been done to me, but by what I had chosen not to do in return. The culmination came in autumn, months after the hearing, when the world outside had cooled and thinned, and the air carried that faint metallic smell of endings. By then, the court's decision had long been made, the story had receded from the public's appetite, and the reporters had found other scandals to feed on. Yet in my life, the echo remained. It lingered not as pain, but as presence, like a scar that throbs only when the weather shifts. I had thought the climax would be the courtroom itself, the moment when Claudia's face was projected onto the wall of justice and her cruelty was exposed for all to see. But it turned out that spectacle was only the prelude. The true climax wasn't about her punishment or my vindication. It was about the quiet, irreversible act of reclaiming my own life from the long shadow of her approval. The transformation wasn't cinematic. It happened in whispers, in paperwork, in one final decision that closed the loop between humiliation and freedom. It began with a letter, a real one, not typed or official, but handwritten on pale stationery that smelled faintly of perfume. The envelope arrived on a Monday morning, slipped through the mail slot with the rest of the bills. I recognized her handwriting immediately. For a long moment, I just stared at it. My heartbeat steady but slow, the way it gets when you stand on the edge of something you once feared. I made tea, sat by the window, and opened it carefully. Her words were brief. "I've sold the house. We're moving abroad. I know you'll think this is running away, but it isn't. I just can't breathe here anymore. The kids don't ask about you. They don't know how to. I'm sorry, but not for what you think. I'm sorry for being your daughter when I wasn't ready to be anyone's. See." The letter was both confession and evasion, a kind of emotional tax payment meant to close the account. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and slid it under the stack of legal papers that had defined the last year. I didn't cry. I didn't even sigh. What I felt was finality. The clean, absolute end of a sentence that had taken decades to finish. That same afternoon, I took a walk to the notary's office on Main Street, a narrow building wedged between a bakery and a pawn shop. The clerk behind the counter looked up, polite but uninterested, and asked what I needed. I placed my documents on the desk, the title to my apartment, the small savings account statement, my new will. "I'd like to update everything," I said, "to make it mine officially." She nodded, slid the papers toward her, and began stamping them one by one. Each thud of rubber on paper sounded like punctuation, the rhythm of a life finally declaring itself autonomous. For years, my identity had been intertwined with others: wife, mother, caregiver, dependent. Every role had required diminishing some part of myself to fit. But that day, signing my name across the clean expanse of each page, I felt something settle into place. The signature was small, the ink ordinary, yet the act was monumental. It was the quietest rebellion imaginable: administrative emancipation. When I left the office, the air was brisk, the sunlight thin and golden. The bakery next door smelled of cinnamon and bread, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I bought a loaf. Warm, heavy, comforting. As I walked home, I passed the supermarket. It had been almost a year since that day, but the automatic doors still hissed open with the same indifferent welcome. I stood outside for a long while, watching shoppers come and go, mothers with carts, children tugging sleeves, the ordinary chaos of errands. The place no longer felt haunted. It was just another building. I walked in, picked up a basket, and made my way to aisle 7. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The shelves gleamed with rows of milk cartons, identical and unassuming. I reached for one, turned it over, checked the expiration date out of habit. The act felt ritualistic, like returning to a battlefield after the war has ended, only to find wildflowers growing through the cracks. I placed the carton gently into my basket and, for the first time, smiled. At the checkout, the cashier, a young man with a shy demeanor, scanned the items and said, "Paper or plastic?" I chose paper. As he handed me the bag, he hesitated. "You're the woman from—" he began, then stopped himself. I saved him the discomfort. "Yes," I said, "I am." He nodded, embarrassed, then murmured, "You handled it well." I looked at him for a long moment and replied, "No one handles it well." Some of us just stop pretending we're still holding it. He didn't understand, of course, but he smiled politely, and I walked out into the cool air. When I reached home, I placed the milk in the refrigerator, sat at the table, and opened my notebook, the one that had begun as a diary of evidence and turned into something softer. I wrote, "Today I bought milk without trembling. Today I stood in the place where I was unmade and remained whole." It wasn't poetry, but it was true, and truth had become my favorite language. That evening, I decided to do something I hadn't done since before the fall, before Claudia, before the slow erosion of self that comes from loving those who weaponize it. I invited someone over. Her name was Esther, my writing teacher turned friend. She arrived with 2 mugs and a small pot of honey. We sat by the window, the city quiet below us, and I told her about the letter, about the notary, about the supermarket. She listened the way good people do, not interrupting, not dramatizing, simply receiving. When I finished, she said, "You've closed the circle." I nodded, unsure what to say. She poured the tea, added honey, and after a long silence, she asked, "Do you feel free?" I thought about that for a while before answering. "No," I said slowly. "I feel unburdened. Freedom still sounds too grand. This is smaller, more private, like the difference between air and breath. I can finally breathe." She smiled, and we sat there as the evening light faded into the soft blue of dusk. Later, after she left, I walked to the window and looked down at the laundromat. Through the glass, I could see the circular motion of the dryers, endless and hypnotic. The clothes turned and turned, water to steam, wet to dry, chaos to order. It struck me that the machines never stop spinning, not out of torment, but out of purpose. They repeat until the task is done, not because they enjoy it, but because that's the only way to become clean. Maybe that's what I had been doing all along, spinning through the endless cycles of forgiveness and forgetting, washing away what didn't belong. But now, finally, I had finished a load. The next morning, I rose early. The world outside was washed in pale light. I made coffee, buttered a slice of the bread I'd bought, and turned on the radio. A soft piece of classical music filled the apartment, something slow and aching. As the notes drifted through the room, I realized that the silence inside me, the one that had once been fear, had changed shape. It was still silence, but now it was spacious, breathable, alive. I went to the cupboard, took down a single cup, and poured myself a glass of milk. The liquid glowed white against the morning light, innocent and familiar. I raised it slowly, almost ceremonially, and drank. It tasted like ordinary life, bland, comforting, completely unremarkable. But for me, it was sacred. I carried the empty glass to the sink and washed it carefully. Outside, children were walking to school, their voices floating upward, bright and careless. I thought of Claudia, somewhere far away, perhaps watching her own children hurry through their mornings, perhaps regretting, perhaps not. It no longer mattered. I wasn't waiting for reconciliation. The story between us had concluded, not neatly, not kindly, but completely. The damage would remain, as all damage does, but it no longer defined the landscape. It was merely one of its features. That afternoon, I took my notebook and went to the park. The trees were shedding their leaves, gold and red, the air thick with that scent of decay that isn't decay at all, but renewal in disguise. I sat on a bench, opened to a fresh page, and wrote, "Rotten like sour cream," she said. "But I have turned, not spoiled. I have fermented into something she can't digest. I closed the book, placed my hand on the cover, and felt the pulse beneath my skin. Steady, certain, present. The true climax, I realized, isn't loud or dramatic. It's the moment you stop needing witnesses. No one will ever clap for survival. It isn't a performance. It's paperwork. It's errands. It's the quiet act of staying. The world will always move on. The headlines will fade. Daughters will leave. But what remains is this: the body still breathing, the kettle still whistling, the milk still fresh in the fridge. I had finally reached the part of the story where nothing extraordinary happens, and that, after everything, felt like the greatest victory of all. The resolution unfolded in the hush that follows revelation, that strange stillness when you've reached the end of the map and the land ahead is your own to name. After the supermarket, the courtroom, the letters, the endless paperwork of reclaiming myself, what remained was a quiet so deep it startled me. I had spent most of my life living inside other people's definitions: daughter, wife, mother, burden. And now there was no label waiting. Freedom, when it finally came, was not bright or triumphant. It was ordinary, the gentle rhythm of days that belonged entirely to me. Autumn slipped into winter, and I found myself learning the art of contentment in small, deliberate ways. I learned how to buy food for one without guilt, how to sit through silence without mistaking it for loneliness, how to let memory soften instead of bruise. The laundromat below kept its steady hum, a mechanical lullaby that reminded me of persistence rather than repetition. In December, I joined a poetry group for seniors at the community center. We met every Thursday evening in a drafty room that smelled of instant coffee and wool coats. Most of the participants wrote about gardens, old lovers, lost pets. I wrote about milk, about how humiliation can curdle and yet become its own form of nourishment. One night, I read a piece called Expiration Date. It began: "They mistook my silence for spoilage, but I was only fermenting." When I finished, no one clapped at first. Then slowly, a woman at the end of the table whispered, "Yes." Just that single word, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. Later, she came up to me and said, "My daughter doesn't speak to me either." I squeezed her hand and said, "Then maybe we're both still ripening." We laughed, quietly but with recognition. That laughter, fragile and shared, was the sound of something mending. The apartment began to change with me. I repainted the walls a pale shade of green, the color of new leaves. I replaced the heavy curtains with lighter ones so the morning sun could spill through without resistance. I bought a rug, soft, woven with deep red and gold threads, that made the room feel anchored. Every object became intentional, chosen by me, for me. It was strange to realize how long I'd lived surrounded by things selected for someone else's taste, my preferences diluted by compromise. Now, even the air felt like my own. I kept the spider plant on the windowsill. It had multiplied again, spilling over the pot, small shoots reaching outward. I decided not to cut them back. Growth, after all, isn't always tidy. One afternoon, while sorting through old papers, I came across the photograph Claudia had left in the folder, the one of us laughing in the kitchen years ago. The edges were curling slightly, the image faded, but our faces were still visible, carefree and unguarded. I didn't feel anger or nostalgia, only a faint ache, like pressing on a healed scar. I placed the photo in a small wooden frame and set it on a shelf, not as an act of forgiveness, but as a record. I didn't want to erase her. I wanted to place her where she belonged. In the past, not as a ghost to haunt me, but as a chapter concluded. Sometimes, when I pass it, I whisper a quiet prayer, not for reconciliation, but for clarity. That she never passes her cruelty down to her children, that they grow up to understand what she couldn't, that love isn't obedience and care isn't control. Winter deepened. I began taking walks in the mornings, bundled in a long wool coat, the air sharp and clean. The city moved at its usual indifferent pace, cars hissing through slush, children dragging backpacks through the snow, strangers brushing past without recognition. I found peace in my anonymity. Once, outside the bakery, I saw a mother scolding her teenage daughter, their voices rising, the girl's face a mix of defiance and hurt. For a moment, I wanted to step forward, to tell them to choose their words carefully, that one day they might echo louder than they intend. But I didn't. I just stood there, invisible and infinite, watching the cycle continue as it always does. Some lessons cannot be inherited. They must be lived, endured, survived. That night, I wrote a letter to Claudia, though I never intended to send it. I began with the truth. You were not born cruel. You learned it the way I learned silence, from watching. I told her I hoped she had found something that resembled peace, even if it wasn't forgiveness. I wrote that she had once been my greatest pride, then my deepest wound, and now she was simply my history, unavoidable, instructive, and finished. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it inside my notebook. Some truths don't need to travel. It was enough that I had written them. By spring, the rhythm of my days had become steady, unremarkable, almost tender. I volunteered twice a week at the library, helping children with reading. One little girl, June, the same one who had once struggled with the word enough, had begun to read aloud with confidence, her small voice clear and certain. When she finished a story one afternoon, she looked up and said, "You always smile when I get the words right." I told her, "That's because I know what it means to finally be heard." She didn't understand the layers of that sentence, but she smiled anyway, proud and innocent, her future still unwritten. Watching her, I realized that these small exchanges of recognition, was what healing truly looked like. Not grand resolutions or apologies, but quiet continuations. Sometimes at night, I sit by the window with a cup of tea and listen to the hum of the city. The same sound that once made me feel lonely now feels like a heartbeat I belong to. I think about the woman in the supermarket, the one standing frozen under the fluorescent lights, dripping milk and shame. And I want to reach back through time and tell her that she survived it, that she turned the wound into language, and that she learned the difference between being broken and being freed. I'd tell her that her dignity didn't wash away with the milk. It only changed form, settled deeper, quieter, truer. I've stopped waiting for closure. Closure suggests the end of motion, and I've learned that life doesn't close. It circles. Some nights I dream of Claudia as a child again, her hand small in mine, her laughter high and reckless. I wake without bitterness. The past, once unbearable, has become simply one of the many rooms I've lived in. I visit it sometimes, but I don't stay. If I could speak to another woman like me, the ones who have been humiliated, dismissed, made invisible, I'd tell her this: there is no expiration date on self-respect. They may pour milk over your head, call you spoiled, rotten, useless, but remember, cheese is just milk that refused to break down quietly. Let yourself ferment. Let time thicken you, sharpen you, make you strong in flavor. One day, someone will taste your truth and call it substance. And when that day comes, you won't need their apology or their admiration. You'll just sit at your own kitchen table, sunlight on your face, tea cooling beside you, and you'll know that survival isn't a headline, it's a habit. You'll know that peace doesn't arrive with fanfare. It arrives in the form of an ordinary morning, a familiar song, a breath that doesn't tremble. That is where my story ends, not in reconciliation or revenge, but in this steady, quiet knowing. I am still here. I am no longer waiting to be loved. I am enough.